I read an excerpt from the first book that I self-published, Sector Storm, which is a kind of, if you were to imagine a universe that's somewhere in between Star Trek and Star Wars, perhaps not my most original idea, but it's essentially a space pirate story, which is pretty much the cheesiest thing you could ever write. But I had this idea, I had a vision for a story that was dark and gritty and realistic, yet exciting and with lots of twists and turns, where you basically don't know who you can trust because you basically can't trust anyone. This was written, how do I put this? This was written almost as a cynical satire of reality, basically. It kind of represents our world. At least that was the concept, although it's not actually a satire. This was back when I liked to write things that were different, or to take a different approach to writing. I guess you could say I was experimenting. The story is basically about 4 characters. 2 are human, 2 are aliens. Their ship crashes and they end up going aboard a merchant ship. So reading from chapter 1. The ancients must be laughing at us. Black fumes burst from the exhaust vents, curling into a great thunderhead of smoke above the maroon starship. The smell of incinerated leather seats, metallic wiring, and burning human flesh blew into Jason's face from the shifting winds of the exotic world. The ship had gutted a wave-like mound of flowered prairie land between jungle boskages. Its white bow lifted high above the black rich soil. It glistened from the glares of falling twin suns blocked behind tall green-barked trees, either pushed or broken aside by the ship, their long red leaves flapping in the wind. Maybe humankind was cursed by the ancients who bioengineered us. Thousands of races damned at creation. Maybe we were never meant to advance so far on our own. Jason O'Connor helped an injured comrade to a smooth silver stone shaped like a seashell. Her name was Charisse Noxeal. He didn't know her very well, but during the crisis she'd acted heroically, taking the forward tactical controls just after the previous officer had been killed by an energy burst from the adjacent console. Without her willingness to sacrifice herself, they never would have contained the fusion reactor breach and made it to an escape pod. The craft had landed near their ship, damaged. Jason lifted her white shirt to see a large purple bruise reaching over her right hip. He gently placed his hand to it and applied pressure. He'd seen comrades die in battle before, but somehow it felt worse when they were female. His mind couldn't handle the fact that their crew were all dead. So many young and gifted officers who had their whole lives ahead of them. It seemed best to focus on the immediacy. Her eyes were closed, but her breath felt strong. Charisse was an attractive young woman. She was tall and had red hair, trimmed short but for long bangs which swooped up with gel like a fiery wave. Yet her most distinctive characteristic was a pattern of connecting black tattoo lines on the right side of her forehead. He'd never bothered to ask what the odd pattern meant to her. In the Alliance fleet, it seemed one never had the time for such trivial regards. Only perhaps they weren't so trivial after all. As much as he admired her for both her mettle and her beauty, he hardly knew the girl he'd fought alongside and had nearly died with. "Do you feel anything?" he asked. "Just tingling," she said. "Is it broken?" "Sounds like nerve damage," Jason said. "Nothing a cellular regenerator couldn't fix. If we had access to a medical bay, that is." "The landing looks worse than ours," remarked Swimdoxus. She was a Clarion. Her skin was purple and scaled. Her eyes were all red except for the pupils. Her pale yellow hair was puffed between two curling crimson horns. Her ears were wide and pointed. Jason had gotten to know her as a dear friend over the past 2 years of service together. Swim had enjoyed spending much time mingling with the men in the lounge. Not that she was a tramp. She merely enjoyed having fun with the good company. Knowing that someone of her warm and resilient spirit had survived gave him comfort. Jason turned and glanced back over his right shoulder. As if on cue, a large black vessel with protruding horn-like projectiles, which set upon a fat rocky mount in a sea of smoke, suddenly exploded. The eruption of white light energy was so great that he was forced to squint and look away. Only the Clarion had the eyes to handle such a burst of light. The tremble which followed shook the ground like an earthquake, casting dust and stones far over the trees miles into the valley below. The ground under their feet shook, prompting them to clamp onto whatever they could. A third ship swooped ahead, away from the explosion. The vessel was also black, but quite broad in shape. It bore no protruding spikes which would have identified it as a Radian warship, but instead its heavy armor overlapped its cannons and thrusters like stylized thorns. "It blasted the Radian ship," said Swim. "Do you recognize the design?" asked Jason. "It doesn't resemble any Radian or Resistance model I've seen." "Doesn't look like an Ulkarab warship either," Swim said. "Too aggressive. Jason's good friend Nasha Fios." Jason's good friend Nasha Fio huffed as he helped a badly wounded Terran male to the ground. Nasha was a Reaper, his body broad, his skin bark-like leather brown. His head appeared exoskeletal as its hard cartilage reflected the shape of the bones underneath its thick overlay. He had a short but broad snout. Yellow motion sensory glands rose up either side of his chin, joining and rising straight up between his eyes and down the back of his head. "Nasha, how is he?" Jason asked. Nasha took the man's right arm into his strong hands. His hands had no normal fingers, but 3 large line thumbs, each with a cord-like cartilage housing a fat artery which neared the tip. "I can't feel much of a pulse," he said. Arepa's voice was soft and gentle, in contrast to the rugged build. "Are you sure?" Jason asked. "My thumbs are more sensitive than your Terran fingers," Nasha reminded with a slight glance. "And I took advanced medical attainee training at the academy. This man is dying." "Maybe that ship will help us," Swim said, covering her eyes as she turned in the direction of the sun as to keep her view focused. The black vessel which had destroyed the Radian cruiser lowered to a field not far away. Hovering just several meters above the ground, a hatch opened and a medium-sized shuttle jettisoned the craft. It was triangular in shape and boasted more thorns than its mothership. It lowered to their location, landing before a brush of exotic pink shrubs and their smoking vessel. Jason stood and straightened his crimson jacket as the shuttle landed. A door lifted and a silver ramp extended to the ground. Several men and women of varying races stepped out. Their leader was Lek, dressed in black leather armor. He stood almost 7 feet tall. His skin was dark as night. Quills extended from his hairless head and neck. His irises glowed red, even in the sunlight. He held only a pistol in his hand. The dozen crew members behind him held shiny black blaster rifles. None of them were the inexpensive or overly stylized sorts found in the free market. These were quality, high-powered weapons, tantamount to those in the Alliance. A sad sight, said the Lek, but a handful of young survivors, a crew of 100 or more burning inside the wreckage of your vessel. The smell is stimulating, isn't it? Jason approached him briskly, but this was met with several blaster rifles in greeting. He stopped, lifting his hands. We have 2 crewmen in need of aid. One is dying. Is he? Said the Lek. He stepped past Jason, his head turning to one side as he studied the bloodied and burned man held in Nasha's caring arms. He needs internal healing, Nasha said. Do you have a cellular regenerator aboard your vessel? We do, said the Lek, but I'm afraid that it's a handheld device, not suitable for more severe injuries. The man is suffering needlessly. He lifted his pistol and fired a burst of bright blue energy through the chest, exiting just over Nasha's left exoskeletal hip bone and pounding through the soil. The phasium blast roared like an electric scream. Its energy was a high-frequency, multiphasic laser beam with destructive particles. Such a weapon on a high setting could melt a hole through stone or titanium. Compact hardware capable of emitting it was cutting-edge and very expensive. Jason gasped, covering his mouth as he turned back to his friends. Nasha lowered the dead crewman's body to the ground. Swim's eyes suddenly turned from sorrow to rage. With silent, slick skill, she pulled her clavadier from her back, a handheld bladed weapon which doubled as a blaster. It resembled a shield with sharp edges severe enough to cut down a mighty Lek warrior, housing in its center a blaster nozzle. She raised it to the leader and held still, ready to either dice or fire. I could drop you right now. No, Swim, don't, Jason cried. That won't help us here. Ah, a clarion, said the Lek, grinning with amusement as he lowered his gun to his side. I was always fascinated by your kind, an all-female race, 4-breasted, bred for the pleasures of men. I'll stop you right there, said Swim, exposing her sharp teeth in a hateful snarl. My sisters were bred to be warriors, once ancient protectors of the ancients. It was the damned Radians who invaded Clarius, dividing my people. Yes, for over 100 years they have bred slaves from my sisters, but they are not true Clarians. If you'd like to see the difference, then I suggest you raise your weapon. Swim, that's enough, Jason said. I'm the highest ranking officer now. That puts me in charge. Swim took a deep breath, lowering her bladed weapon. She had 4 eyebrows as well, at the moment twisted in wild expression. I'm sorry, she said. But, Jason, he was already dead, said the Lek. I was merely doing the humane thing. You prefer your fallen to suffer to death? Cultural differences, perhaps. We appreciate your help, Jason said. With the Radians, I mean. Don't flatter yourself, said the Lek. We are a free market ship. Why would we risk our lives over some Alliance spy vessel? And that is what you are, right? Deep inside Sector Storm, Resistance territory. And near Radian space, no less. We were hiding in stealth mode while we watched your little conflict unfold. We didn't care to risk detection unnecessarily. But we are loyal to the Resistance, and an opportunity to destroy a Radian warship was too good to resist. Maybe you were hoping to have something to salvage, Swim said with a snarling grin. You fired too hastily. It wasn't on my orders, said the Lek, but that's my story. His burning red eyes narrowed upon Jason. I can't discuss our mission, Jason said. I see no reason to talk any further, said the Lek. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it here. The scenery is quite lovely. You don't even know what planet you're on, do you? Negotiate. Jason, thanks. Negotiate. Talk. It's your only hope. We are, or were, merely a scout ship, said Jason. I'm Lieutenant Jason O'Connor, Strategy Officer. I was 5th in command. 5th, said the Lek. You look a little young to be 5th. I am 24, Jason said. You might say I'm ambitious. You've met Sundoxis, a skilled security officer. Beside her is Nashafio, a Repa science officer, and our injured comrade, Sharice Noxil, skilled and tactical. I see. My name is Rashar. I am a Lek, operations officer, 2nd in command of the Shade Marauder. Rashar raised his chin as if to reach for any bargaining chips which they might have held back to persuade him to mercy. This triggered something in Jason. He was a passionate man, although while serving in the Galactic Alliance he learned to suppress it. Perhaps it was bottled rage for the fear of his crew that stirred in him now, or the bruised ego in being at the whim of such heartless criminals. But while face to face with his roguish leader and his penetrating stare, it seemed like a wise time to loosen his collar. An independent trade vessel, remarked Jason with a humored grin. One so heavily armored, named the Shade Marauder, with a crew so armed and confident, obviously well trained for combat. Many of our security team have served in the Radiant Wars, Rashar said. Life in the Joint Resistance Fleet is not nearly as leisurely as serving aboard an Alliance craft, with your game rooms and massage parlors. Some Resistance fighters grow tired of fighting for glory and turn to trade to make their fortunes. And they've earned the right, unlike you overprivileged Alliance pigs. If it wasn't for your extensive training, you'd be utterly useless in combat. Swim moaned. Jason smirked. I think she disagrees with you, he said. She may be a warrior, Rashar said, but how about you? Pretty-faced, clean-cut, neat hair. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a spoiled child, trying to play a role assigned to him because he's playing by the rules. You Alliance officers are all alike. Clones, not men. Gutless. So much for talk. If I can't earn his respect... Jason stepped face to face with Rashar, swallowing his fears and staring deep into his burning red irises. Word can't buy Nelium, Jason said. Actions teach what words preach. An old Terran expression. That's so, Rashar said, locking his weapon to a magnetic holder on his belt. Then show me what you've got, Terran. The tall Lek stood before him, arms low and loose at his sides. Jason lifted his arms for the Lek's throat, but Rashar lifted his to block. Jason grabbed his wrists and pulled on them, using Rashar's own strength for momentum, as the Lek pulled him back. To swing his right leg in for a firm kick in his side, Rashar gasped. Jason let go and stepped away, huffing as his heart began to beat hard in his chest. The onlookers from both sides began to cheer them on. Quietly at first, but increasingly louder as Rashar flexed his muscles, pushing at his thick black polyester attire, and then approached his opponent. Again Jason faked to grab at Rashar, then dropping to the ground and swooping his leg around the Lek's ankle. As tall and strong as he was, Rashar fell fast, landing hard upon the left shoulder. Jason waited for him to stand, focused yet excited. He hadn't felt so alive for a long time. Fighting enemies in the stars was one thing, and combat training had been exhilarating at times, but hard hand-to-hand combat was quite another. The last time he'd been in a physical fight, he was too weak and poorly skilled to hold his own. This time he believed he had the edge he needed to win. Rashar rose to his feet with deep, bitter eyes. He growled and charged Jason. Just before impact, Jason leapt aside. But like a lively cat, Rashar jumped onto him. They rolled over the grass, arms struggling for domination. Jason put all his skills to good use, attempting to manipulate Rashar's weight and to use his own force against him. But Rashar's movements were too sharp and unpredictable for him to handle. "You can do it," Sharice called, hands to either side of her mouth to focus her vocal wave to the noise around her. Nasha said nothing, but did not have to.
Jason knew the Reaper dislike for violence, as well as their deep compassion for the welfare of a good friend. Rashar grabbed onto Jason's shoulders as he squirmed, then pushing him hard against the ground. He grabbed Rashar's arms but could not budge him. Was firmly pinned. Rashar grinned wide at him. "Have you, Torin?" he boasted. Jason faked a sorrowful expression, and then pulled back his knees and thrust them into Rashar's hips. Jason cried out from the pain caused when he pushed with all his might, with the greater strain upon his already injured shoulders. Rashar was pushed back. Jason pulled back his knees, kicking his hard leather boots into Rashar's stomach. "Ah!" Rashar cried, collapsing upon the ground, his arms wrapped around his stomach, his back arcing almost into a ball as he coughed and cursed under his breath.